This episode is part one of a series on public education in America. This particular episode is the initial discussion on student loans, including a discussion on the recent Supreme Court case. Further episodes in this series aim to explore the cultural and political climate in regards to public education and solutions and ideas to the debt crisis and education reform. Thanks, as always, for tuning in.
This is
Always remember
the ModState Podcast. And now, your hosts.
remember, others may hate you.
Well, good morning to you, to whoever else is listening, whatever time it is. How are you?
Doing all right.
Excellent.
Doing all right. I have a cup of coffee, so we're good to go.
It's actually a difference. Maybe not the beverage of choice during our evening podcasts, but it is nice. Cheers. I've got my cup of coffee here as well. Good. Well, I think we've got a good one today. I did receive some feedback that some listeners wanted to hear a more topic-oriented episode, and I totally agree, and I think we're due for one. And we were talking about a few potential topics we were throwing out there, and it seemed like student loans was one of them that kept coming back. I think before we get started on this episode, a couple things up front. I do hold significant student loans. I did have my undergrad paid for, so I dodged a bullet there. I also chose a specific university that I knew would be more expensive than a traditional public school. Also something I understand. I think in this conversation, it is less about what I owe and my personal feelings towards student loans than it is my concern collectively, I suppose. And I think the other caveat to this is I am not a student loan expert. I am not, but I think given the fact that it's in front of the Supreme Court, that up front, I think there's regardless of what happens with the student loans at the Supreme Court level, there will likely be some positive changes to the broader public that holds student loans that I think will be worth talking about. What are your thoughts initially? Because I know we've gone up and down. We've had lots of good discussion about this.
I would have to say that, for the record, I am also someone who holds about a similar amount of student loan debt. I did choose to do 2 years of community college and ended up paying that off. And then I went on to get a bachelor's and a master's, and now I'm looking at law school. So this is also pretty close to home for me.
You're definitely staring down the barrel of significant. It's funny, we call it debt, but we also call mortgage debt as well. But it's a different kind of debt. It's not a credit card debt. I think there's an ROI attached to it that I think is a bit different. But before we dive in, let's just say thank you for tuning into the ModState Podcast. For more opinion pieces or some written form, go ahead and head over to modstate.com. If you want to get a hold of us, also hit us up at modstate@modstate.com, wherever you're listening in the world. Thank you for tuning in, and now to our show. Okay, pleasantries out of the way. Should we save our trivia quiz? Do we want to? Is that something towards the end we want to do, or are we just feeling some good student loan energy? Do you just want to dive into student loans?
Well, what is the quiz?
That's a good question. Let me see. I've been trying to just grab one and just go for it. Let me see. Dun dun dun. Name that U.S. National Park quiz. That's a picture, so that's not going to work. We did the citizenship, countries and capital quizzes. That'll be a good one. But we'll do that. Why don't we tee that up?
Do that at the end.
Yeah, that works.
Save my brain power.
Fair enough. Okay. So when we first started having this conversation, obviously, I think we dove into it pretty quickly. I think what you get in precast sometimes is a pretty unfiltered opinion on where we stand. And I think it's important to have unfiltered conversations. I don't mean filtered, but tempered. You know, I when we have good conversations and debate around things, I'd rather us not hold back. But I was thinking, like, how do we tee this up? And I think it is important. Why are we having this conversation? Why are we kind of annoyed by the state of where we're at in a completely non-victim way? I fully knew.
Absolutely.
I fully knew what I was getting into. And unfortunately, I don't know that a lot of people know what they're getting into. Which I think is one point of contention that I have. I mean, obviously you're signing for the loans, you're doing all this stuff, but I think as an 18-year-old to be so easily get a loan, whether that's private or through Mohila or through backed by the federal government, it's still pretty easy. I'll tell you, it was really easy for me to get X amount in student loans than it was to get a car loan back when interest rates were 0. So definitely an interesting process there. But I figured we'd kind of tee up some statistics, which I think are pretty interesting because this is why we're here, right? And just some highlights. And this is pretty, and I'll put these in the show notes as well, just so people aren't, me just making up statistics, but this comes from educationdatainitiative.org. I'll put it in the show notes, although you could pretty much find these statistics pretty much anywhere. So the average annual cost of tuition at a public 4-year college is 35 times higher than tuition in 1963. Over the last decade, tuition inflation has averaged 4.63% annually from 2010 to 2020. So that's pretty significant because that's annually. Then the cost of tuition at public 4-year institutions increased 31% from 2010 to 2020. And then after adjusting for currency inflation, college tuition has increased 747% since 1963. So the most extreme decade, ironically, for tuition inflation was the 1980s, when tuition prices increased by 121%. So
notably also to the 80s is, we'll talk about Reagan in a little bit.
Yeah.
The influence he had on that in the 80s.
Yes, I'll be, I'm actually quite interested in some of that history there. So again, I think what's the biggest takeaway, if you're not a numbers person or just my initial glance at that, is that is a significant inflation number. That percentage is not trivial. That's crazy. And I think you could probably make a strange correlation to like home prices, property values, which I think probably and ironically will tie into the ability, I guess, the way things like property values makes it unachievable for a huge portion of the population to partake in. The same way with student loans to a degree, although student loans are more of the price to play, right? It's the price of entry, and yeah, and so here we are in front of the Supreme Court. Over the last several years, spanning 2 administrations, there has been a punting of turning student loans back on. So for anyone who's listening internationally, I hope you're equally as frustrated listening to this. However, what was done starting in the Trump administration, which I think is important also to understand, that there was no partisanship in terms of student loans. I think it was the right call at the right time, that we turned off the repayment responsibility, or the payment responsibility. It was turned off sort of indefinitely, and also no interest, the compound interest, which often happens in a U.S. student loan situation. Compound interest means that unlike a 7% interest rate on the loan for its life, it is compounding 7% until the loan is paid off. So that's what makes it so difficult, is that there's really no relief. It's not as if you just got rid of your interest and now you're working strictly on principal. There's always an interest attached to it, and it becomes so problematic. So all of that was turned off. And what we're talking about now is essentially turning them back on. And the Biden administration decided that, hey, we would like to cut $10,000 for pretty much all student loan debt carriers under $125,000 per year. That would be your income cap. And if you had Pell Grants, you are eligible for $20,000 in debt relief. And then there's a couple other proposals that actually are less talked about. And if I'm missing any of them, let me know. But the two, and there may be a few more subtle ones, but the high level extras that actually aren't necessarily on the chopping block for the Supreme Court, is a new a rebalancing of the income driven repayment model. So in the past, there was, I think, a bit more variability there. So you could pay anywhere from 10% of your income back to up to like 20%, which is still pretty significant. That would be, I think, what is it? Cost of living, like living is supposed to be 20% of your take home pay, or 20% of your overall pay. That's what you're supposed to allocate for that. And then 20% of debt is pretty significant. And so they're going to cap that. And then the other piece is the interest. If you are making your minimum payment on income on the income driven repayment model, you won't accrue any interest. And I think that could easily be to me personally, because $20,000 or $10,000 for me personally is great, but is not as large of a percentage of the debt burden that I carry than most Americans do. And so the debt relief at $10,000 to $20,000 would be super significant for a number of individuals. Whereas I guess grad school folks, people that have taken on a pretty large debt burden, just if we were just staring down the barrel of zero interest, with minimum payments, I think most people are pretty okay with that. At least that would be the anecdotal experience in the circles that I run. That seems fairly prudent. So I'll pause there. What did I miss?
Did we also talk about minimum wage, other costs of living?
Well, I mean, I didn't specifically talk about minimum wage, but I think it's a good call out. You brought it up in terms of when we're seeing an annual rate increase since 2010 of like 4.5% or whatever it was. It's a good call out. Okay, so I'm working minimum wage.
Here we go. So I would just like to point out that my dad went to college, he went to university in the 1960s, and he went to UT's Macomb School of Business, and he paid $400, I think, a year. Might have been semester a year, which is significantly less now. But when you adjust it for inflation and you look at someone working a minimum wage job, let's say in the 1980s, because that's when a lot of the conversation about this starts, it was minimum wage was $3.10, which is equivalent to $12 today. So minimum wage was $12, and we haven't raised our minimum wage from, what is it, $7.25?
Correct.
Since 2009, when I was in high school.
Correct.
Which is a significant, that's just over, or just over half, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and I think some states have done a good job of recognizing,
of meeting that for sure. But
it's
I'll
still,
say I live in Texas and they have not.
Yeah, exactly. But I think we could probably create a pretty strong political state line map in terms of who has raised minimum wage and who has not, who's done a good job and who hasn't. And Texas would very clearly fall on my list of a state that probably hasn't really adjusted that minimum wage. But that's important, right? Because what it's showing us is that, and again, I teed this up, that I am not here to sound like a victim, and I hear myself talking about it, but it really is just the state of affairs. And that is, you could do more in that time on a minimum wage salary or a minimum wage than you can today. I mean, that's just the reality. And we've talked about this quite a bit on this show, because there are times I think we've opined for, but I think different groups of people opine for different time periods for different reasons. Mine is that I am getting quite a different ROI from student loans from 20, 30, 40 years ago than I am today. And it's significant. So I didn't mean to cut you off there. I mean, it is interesting that the 80s certainly had but then again, inflation was pretty significant through those times anyway. What was it that really set us off in the direction that we are going? I think we've talked a couple podcasts already about isms and the changing landscape from a political perspective, and a desire to kind of move a different direction. And that did happen around Reagan. That was this sort of like neoliberal shift in the political climate, the culture writ large. Take me there.
So it was in 1965 that the federal government began guaranteeing student loans by banks. I guess this comes, let me see, from banks and nonprofit lenders, which is the FFELT, or the Federal Family Education Loan. But we really see a lot of this kick off in the 80s with Reagan. And I think I'll have to pull up his name. You'll excuse me. It's a Sunday morning.
That's okay. It's the day of recharge for the entire week. So if you need an extra 10 seconds to find a name, we won't hold it against you, Candace.
But you have headlines where people are talking in, 1985, in this LA Times archive. This article is titled "Reagan Calls Student Loan Cuts Reasonable and Just," and that some families are just going to have to make difficult adjustments. But a lot of this.
And was that this kind of mind shift that we need to start taking on more risk, or we need to, it's almost like a utilitarian approach. Like, you know what, kind of sucks to suck. But what was the motivation? It clearly was a funding, a cost. At this time, the government was trying to really cut everything they could.
They were, but also I'm trying to pull up the specific quote so that I don't misquote anybody. But under the Reagan administration, there was also talk about we're creating a dangerous educated proletariat.
That wasn't Reagan, was it?
That comes from Roger Freeman.
Okay,
so in 1970, Roger Freeman, who worked for Nixon, revealed that the right's motivation for coming decades of attacks on higher education. And that is where you get these quotations. And they saw this as leading towards fascism.
Got it.
We're in danger of producing an educated proletariat. That's dynamite. We have to be selective on who we allow to go to college.
Oh, so what? Hold on. So what you're telling me is that the party of small government wants to decide who gets to and who does not get to go to university, and effectively make it cost prohibitive. They couldn't have just said, hey, this is not sustainable, this price. Like, we have to increase the price. We have to do this now in order to fund it. And then, I mean, that in itself is disingenuous, but like.
Oh, for sure. And it's not to say that it's one or the other, right? Like but I don't think we can discount the fact that from the 60s to 80s, you have a concern with universities being the center for civil rights movements and other forms of activist
that's
discourse. And to create a system where only wealthier people, which,
Mhm.
especially at the time was mostly white, you're preventing a lot of groups of people of color who can't afford it from accessing these places of activism. And I don't think that was unnoticed.
Yeah, and it's a
Not that it was the main intention or the driving reason for it, but I don't think we can discount that.
yeah. I mean, it would seem kind of overtly classist and racist in some cases, and so it would be hard to lead with that. Although I guess at the time, so Reagan in '66, so he
Mhm.
won in '66. This was in California as a governor, and was immediately started to get pretty confrontational with the University of California school system. And then
Oh yeah, where
in
he vowed to clean up the mess.
yeah, in 1970 he shut down all the UC and Cal State campuses.
Mhm.
In midst of there was some student protesting for the Vietnam War and U.S. bombing Cambodia. So right off the bat, you can see, um, you can see where this is going. So that is where Roger Freeman came in, his education advisor. Yep, and you're right. And he said we're in
Yeah.
danger of producing
And
an educated proletariat.
just to back that up, there was an FBI memo at that time where he cracked down on UC that said Reagan was dedicated to the destruction of disruptive elements on California campuses.
Mm. Freeman also said, taking a highly idiosyncratic perspective on the cause of fascism, that's what happened in Germany, and I saw it. We will have a large number of highly trained and unemployed people. That was the claim, which is interesting, right? So at that time, would there have been more of those quote unquote traditional, like white collar jobs? I guess maybe not. There's certainly, but this was coming out of the World War II, so we had the we did have free public education for GIs that came back, pretty broad socialist type policies that the veil was, it is our troops, it is our boys, we're going to take care of them. I mean, we had VA loans for housing, education. I mean, there's a host of really social kind of programs that I think resonated strongly with a lot of Americans because these guys were heroes. They were the greatest generation. And so it made sense. But then you think, so that's 1945, 1955. Now this is 20 years post, and all of a sudden there's this fundamental shift. Now we're in the Vietnam War, totally not popular, not the greatest generation, and you've got all these darn kids not liking the fact that we're bombing Cambodia.
Right, so they must be overeducated.
So here we are, and I don't think it's necessarily your opinion, but this is your tee up here. Like, this is Reagan in California going to kind of battle with college campuses, with students, and all of a sudden we have this highly classist comment by the kind of the Betsy DeVos of the time.
I mean, to be fair, his vice president also made comments along similar lines.
It's actually pretty interesting when you go back, and maybe this is a departure of what you were going to say, but when you really dig into the principles of, we think of Reagan. Reagan is, he's like the father of modern neoliberalism, which is really more like the figurehead of a cycle of a type of conservatism that happens, will come back at some point. It will manifest itself as something else in the future. I truly believe, and it's only my opinion, I am not an expert, so no one take this super to heart, but we will ebb and flow with the role of the federal government in our lives. And again, FDR was a framework, and then Reagan became a framework. For example, Clinton was a Democratic president, but he was just as equally into cutting government spending, maybe probably a bit less than other Republican presidents at the time, but it still operated under this framework. And this was the beginning of this new framework.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
We talk about frameworks and cycles, but I also like highlighting when we talk about history is that this was just the 70s and 80s I mean, our parents and grandparents, the people who are still in government and in power today, like they lived this. It's the same people. So I don't want to disconnect what happened at this time from sentiments that will still exist today inside the same human beings. Because it wasn't just Reagan. I mean, so you have Spiro Agnew saying unqualified students are being swept into college on the wave of the new socialism. You have conservative intellectuals also upset about this because free education may be producing a positively dangerous class situation by raising working class expectations. Another refers to students as a parasite feeding on the rest of society who exhibit a failure to understand and to appreciate the crucial role played by the reward punishment structure of the market.
Jesus.
So, yeah, it's more than just Reagan and the Reagan administration, right? These are people who still, vote and create policy today.
What?
And I don't think, and I'm pointing this out not to say this is the reason for all of this, but within that context, you have, at least from what I see, a similar thing happening now where there is a concern with how educated, progressive campuses are.
So
and student bodies.
So what you're basically, the undertones or reading between the lines here is that this idea of academia being these bastions of liberal progressive thought, it really is almost like a roundabout way of saying, like, we don't really want that. And
I would think so. And to back that up, I would say a good documentary y'all can go watch, and this is not higher education, but it still speaks to this system of how this happens, is go watch The Revisionaries. I think that the full version is up for free on YouTube, and it's a documentary about the public education system in Texas and how Texas Board of Education and the curriculum they choose determines what a lot of the rest of the country studies. And it's about the fight between creationism and evolution and how to teach that in schools.
Do you think, I mean, it's funny you bring that up because I actually remember reading about the fight between creationism and evolution in my 9th grade biology class in public school, right? And that really, I'm sure there's been fights in education and what we're teaching people, and probably more like who can get educated and who can't get educated. And then all of a sudden there's this direct policy fight in terms of how we would be talking about science. So it's interesting. Anyway, didn't mean to cut you off on that, but.
No, it's for sure true. So just within the context of talking about student loans and possible solutions, right, for the situation that we are in now, I think it's very important that people take these perspectives into account when determining whose responsibility it is to fix certain aspects of this crisis and whose responsibility it is to burden or, to take on the burden of paying back this debt. And to speak to that point, there was one article from, I think it was actually on Fox. So I'll just say I was reading through it was an editorial opinion on Fox talking about the problem. And again, if I've misquoted myself, don't worry, I'll find the article and put it in the show notes. But their problem with this student debt crisis, the crisis was that people were not going to be paying back these loans because they get forgiven after 20, 25 years. So their concern was not with the burden on students having to pay these back. And their concern was also with the fact that there was an income-based payment plan at all. And there was no concern taken in, no concern with the fact that a lot of people cannot afford to pay back their loans without an income-based repayment plan, simply because wages have not kept up with. Again, we're talking about minimum wage, which is just over half of what it was.
Correct.
In what, 1980?
Yeah.
Right? So minimum wage has essentially gone down.
Mm-hmm. So I want to pull on some threads that you left.
Oh, absolutely. And I got more to say on the topic, but let's pull on the threads. We'll see if we get to the same place.
Okay. So I wanted to make sure that before we kind of deep dive on the SCOTUS case and continue to go down the path you're going down, that from a demographic perspective on where we are today, who is affected, and also really more broadly, like the population breakdown in the US and why, I guess maybe my thoughts, and I'll be curious on yours. Because we talked about obviously the fundamental issue of payment. We've talked about class. We've talked about how it was teed up in the past, whether that was truly how they felt or not. That's certainly what was messaged, and it isn't great. If that's what they were messaging and what they were thinking, if they're two different things, I'd maybe not want to know what they were thinking. Although I could think about a couple of things. So, from a 30,000 foot view in America today, is it necessary that we have all these people going to college? So the flip side is, do we need bachelor degrees for every entry level job out there? So that's one question. Is it really fundamentally that important? Well, I guess I would probably argue on that one. I don't know how much control the government has or anyone has on, at this point, needing an entry level 4-year college degree for some jobs that don't necessarily pay that much, but it's just the nature of, it's like a byproduct of the system, right? And I don't think anyone can wave a magic wand and say that all of these 20 million jobs out there will just no longer need a degree in order to in order to have that job. So my question is, what is the actual need for college? What we do know is that university does lift people and does create wealth over time. That isn't just for one set demographic group. It just broadly, if you get a 4-year degree or any sort of college degree, it's going to bring you up to that next level of jobs that you're available for. One argument that I hear a lot is, we do need blue collar jobs for what it's worth. We do need, but you're absolutely right. I would argue, I think we need to make those jobs more attractive, but the reality is, from a libertarian perspective, you're going to do your own thing. The military is not for everybody. And it takes a special person to get your health, or excuse me, well, your health care, but also your student loans paid for by the military. It takes a special person, and not everyone should do that. Not everyone's cut out for federal government service or state level civic duty service. In fact, there's not enough jobs for everybody to do that. So even in the military, and then working for the federal government or the state local government is still not achievable for most people. And then not everyone's cut out to be an electrician, a plumber, or on a factory line, or a metal worker, or a mill worker. Not everyone's cut out to do that. And the whole point of that too is there is still a debt increment that a lot of those people are going to get. I look at being a medical assistant, right? That is a great entry-level job into healthcare, and some people make fantastic careers doing that. It still costs $15,000 to get that. So
Absolutely.
It really
Absolutely.
doesn't matter what you do unless, and then, so then the difference is you just an entrepreneur. And so you incur a business loan as opposed to a student loan, right? So there's always going to be a cost to whatever you want to do. And for most people, I want to say most people, that's generalizing, launching off to get a advanced degree greater than a GED or a high school diploma is what is going to open the world up for them. And so I think it's disingenuous when we say, oh, you can find something without going to school. That just is not true for most people, and is completely disingenuous. So I just wanted to make sure I threw that out there. And again, I'm pulling at some threads you're saying, and I do want to circle back. But the other piece that I wanted to say is that this is going to affect 43 million people. 20 million will have their debt erased, and it will cost somewhere around $400 billion over the next 3 decades.
So to pull at these threads some more, I do want to go on to say that one of the biggest issues I have is with determining like who's burdened by this. And this, the person who wrote this article was so concerned that people would have their debt written off after 20 years and then it would become the debt, the burden of taxpayers. And I'm just looking at this thinking, sir, who do you think taxpayers are? So when you look at student loans, you have the burden of the actual debt, you have the burden of the interest on this debt, and you also have the debt as a taxpayer of previous student loans. So the people paying back their loans now with this interest are concurrently at the same time also burdening the student debt that people have already stopped paying on.
Mm-hmm. So it's
right. They're already taking on this burden.
correct.
Right.
So,
At reduced, wages and inflated prices of living across the board. So I do have to say I think it's fair to take that into account,
mm-hmm.
right? I'm not in the camp that people shouldn't have to pay back their student loans. We
Absolutely.
did, right? But I think that it's a larger picture than just saying, oh, we took out the loan, we're responsible for paying it back. We need to look at the cost of tuition and what's allowed it to get quite so high. Because I can tell you right now, it's not going to paying most faculty or staff income or salaries.
And I mean, I think I certainly acknowledge, and you do, when everyone is having the discussion about reducing the debt burden, right? I think when we talk about reducing the debt burden or begin talking about it in a way that isn't as if like, hey, we should just take full responsibility for the loans that we've taken out. But I do acknowledge that it may sound like I'm giving handouts or something like that, but that's really not the case. I don't have, again, I'm not an expert here. I don't have a whole lot of great solutions to cut the fat, cut the cost. I think that's a great policy conversation for an absolute expert. But I think and I think you're probably saying the same thing. This is the model we have. Like, university is going to be a path for a lot of people. And I completely disagree with Freeman. I think an educated population is a way better population. I'm not going to sit here and espouse the why everyone should have higher education as if you can't be like a moral smart person without a higher education. That's not the case. It just is proven in our society that it is important broadly for many reasons, including wage, right? We've
touched on this before, and I want to point out that I do not align with educated elite mentalities, but I do think that creating access for anyone who wants it to, access education is beneficial to society as a whole.
Correct.
But it is not beneficial for certain groups in pulling the wool over other people's eyes, because if you can control the information that they know or that they believe is true, it's much easier to get them to vote or support you in the ways that they would prefer.
Yep. And so let's, I think this is going to open up a little bit more conversation in terms of maybe the partisan divide on the idea of student loan forgiveness. And so I don't want to miss the SCOTUS case and why we're talking about this specifically. Because here we are fundamentally, or having a fundamental conversation about, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? And I think we could easily find, at least the plaintiffs in this case, found that they were going to be severely hurt from this program or doing this, on top of just whether or not it was within the right of the Biden administration to do this anyway, which I think was a pretty compelling case made by one of the liberal justices. So basically they're hearing two challenges to this plan. So one involves 6 Republican-led states that sued, and the other, obviously the plaintiff, the lawyers needed some people. So they found 2 students. The lower court dismissed the lawsuit involving the following states: Arkansas, Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, and South Carolina. Again, we're already seeing sort of the partisan divide here. You don't see You didn't see Colorado on there. The court said that the states could not challenge the program because they weren't harmed by it. So, okay, that's what we got to go find. We got to go find someone. And in the U.S. Court of Appeals in the Eighth Circuit, of note, were appointed by Republican presidents, put the program on hold during the appeal. So then we have these two students, Myra Brown, who's ineligible for debt relief because her loans are commercially held, and then Alexander Taylor, who's eligible for $10,000 but not the full 20, and so he feels harmed by that. And then they say the Biden administration didn't go through the proper process. And here we are. We're at the Supreme Court, and the piece here is the HEROES Act. So the one of the conversations is, hey, were you guys actually harmed by this? And a good call out by, in fact, one of the conservative justices was, so MOHELA is an arm, essentially is everyone who has student loans knows MOHELA. That is where most of your federal loans are processed, housed. And if there's anyone that would be financially worse off by having absolution of student debt, it would be MOHELA. Well, guess who didn't come to the table as a plaintiff in this situation? It was MOHELA. And in fact, Amy Coney Barrett actually brought that up. Although the major question then again is, with this Supreme Court, it's okay, is it a states' rights thing? Is it a congressional thing? And I think a lot of people are sort of upset that they're kind of cherry picking who and when is affected and who should have the rights to oversee this, when the HEROES Act, the Higher Education Relief Opportunities for Student Act, commonly known as the HEROES Act, was enacted after September 11th and was initially intended to keep service members from being worse off financially when they went to war in Afghanistan and Iraq, which makes sense, right? So, and it's extended to allow the Secretary of Education to waive or modify the terms of federal loans as necessary in connection with a national emergency. Well, COVID-19, wherever you line up politically, was a national emergency one way or another. And so the case is being made that this is a national emergency and that under this HEROES Act, the Department of Education and the President of the United States, who oversees that department, is able to do that. And I think it was Kagan was like, some of this stuff is really cloudy, and that's why it comes up to us to set a precedent. But this is about as clear of an executive within the scope of the executive branch as possible. And there is this kind of counter argument from the right-leaning side of the bench that says, well, I mean, this is, what do they call it? The questions, major questions. They're like, I don't know, maybe this is something Congress should really hash out. And which we know nothing's going to happen there. So it's pretty convenient that this, as because it was originally for war and COVID's not war, it really doesn't fit quite into that definition. Although Kagan's saying, yeah, it does. I mean, it is, it fits like a glove. And here we are. There's also another piece of this, and just jump in here if I'm off base, but the other component to this is whether or not these two individuals are actually, and really in general, every one of the plaintiffs is actually in a position to make a case against themselves. And if that is the case, then this whole thing gets tossed, and we can move on. So there's a couple. One thing you notice here is that one thing to notice here is that the other components to this are not in it. So interest rates and some of the income driven repayment stuff. But really this resolves around debt itself. So what am I missing from this case? There's maybe some subtle nuances that I've missed that are important, but that's sort of why we're having this conversation. And my question for you is, what do you think happens here?
So I wouldn't be surprised if, I guess this was struck down, and which doesn't help me, right? So I do understand that. It would be great if I could keep 20,000 off, kick 20,000 off my loans. But I also understand that it really is a Band-Aid, right? If they allow us to stay in place, and great, we get 20,000, 10,000 off our loans, everything else that goes with that. It is a Band-Aid, right? We still have the same system that we're struggling with. And I mean, I'm not quite sure where else to go from there.
Yeah.
Specifically on what happens with SCOTUS.
Right.
Because I think it's a much larger issue than just the SCOTUS case. And it kind of makes me sad that we're still so limited in our scope when we're talking about this. It should be a much larger conversation.
Yeah. Well, and I do agree. I mean, I don't think anyone disagrees that there is massive reform needed in the education system in general, right? I think there's that like policy wonk side of this where it says like, how do we fix this? And look, if we don't get 10 or 20,000, I think the executive branch will do some smart things. Like I've already teed it up. I've said it 10 times already, between interest rates and income-driven repayment models. And beyond that, I don't have. I mean, we can definitely kind of open up the latter part of this conversation in terms of like why the things that are frustrating about university itself, and then just what I think is sort of an America First model, and could flip the script on how we think about university. But again, I don't have great solutions, but I also believe that as we sort of self-actualize as a society, as our democracy continues to go through its ebbs and flows, and it's being tested, there's so many things that are going on in our country today that are creating unrest, right? That it isn't some enemy across the ocean. It's COVID. It is class. It's all these things that make people angry. And I think being angry about this is interesting. Ultimately, go ahead.
I do see an opportunity here, though, right? A lot of what we've been talking about is this kind of pull between needing an educated, like a higher education educated population, and a lack of blue collar workers. But I also see this as trade school costs anywhere from $5,000 to $15,000, right? Mm-hmm. So again, we talked about you're still accruing a debt.
Yeah.
But we also had a reduction in the amount of, I guess, factory, blue collar, manufacturing jobs in the U.S. But with bringing, I guess, chip facilities and other sorts of manufacturing back to the U.S., there's an opportunity here to bolster that portion of the population. So you won't have quite as much of a burden with people trying to go and get a college education, because there will be an opportunity to get a job that pays enough.
Correct.
Without doing so. And I think before there wasn't.
Mm-hmm. Well, I totally agree. I mean, if we think about good jobs, making good money in a job that maybe traditionally doesn't pay the same as it did, 30 years ago, it was the same administration that sort of paved the road for sending jobs overseas for cheaper labor, right? So there's a better bang for your buck on capital, right? And that wasn't happening in the US. And so if there's less manufacturing jobs, there's less of all this. What are people going to do? I mean, a higher education is clearly like a viable path forward with a much costlier ROI. And this boils down to, I think you're kind of leading into what I was going to say in terms of how are we, like, I feel like we're still, half of us are living in sort of this Freeman model, right? Where it's like, you know what, if you can't pay for it, don't do it. If you don't want to pay it back, don't do it. X, Y, and Z. It maybe is a different kind of argument.
I do want to call out though that a lot of the people saying, well, if you can't afford it, don't do it, are the same ones who are creating a situation where you go and you get a master's degree, and the only opportunity is you have to go get an unpaid internship for 2 years to have enough work experience. You have to have the bachelor's, the master's, and the unpaid internship before they will allow you access to a just above poverty line wage for a decade.
Yeah,
where they can fire you at any point. So I will have to say, I'm gonna call them out, because you can't. They're trying to have their cake and eat it too.
Fair.
And sir, I don't really care about you accruing more wealth when most of us, I think, if it is over half of the U.S. population that lives just above the poverty line.
Mm-hmm.
I think poverty line's like 32,000, and like half of the U.S. or like the mode, not the average. It's like what, 38,000
I think that
dollars a year.
Yeah.
So most of the U.S. population lives just above poverty line.
So I've just been beating around the bush, and what I'm trying to say, and I think you likely would agree with, is that education, given the trajectory that we are going currently in the U.S., is an America first policy. Mm-hmm. It is, and I see it manifest in an interesting way in healthcare. So, and we do rely in our healthcare system on what people would consider doctors coming in from abroad or nurses coming in from abroad. And there's huge programs right now in the nursing field of bringing nurses in from the Philippines and from Mexico and fast tracking visas and green cards in order to fulfill a really important role in our healthcare system. Now, I am thankful for every single one of them as someone who's in healthcare. It's not about them, and I'm not trying to be ethnocentric about it, but it points to a larger problem that there are American citizens lining up to want to, go into the nursing field, for example. And part of that is I think the fact that the cost itself is incidental. It doesn't matter, because you just are going to incur X amount of debt for this job. It's just sort of what is going to happen. There's no way around it. Yet it's sort of like there's definitely a problem, right? Like, we are bringing in labor and professionals from abroad. And some of that is cost prohibitive too, right? For a lot of nurses, like, it doesn't make sense to incur $20,000 to $40,000 in debt. But then also there's the problem of faculty that aren't paid enough to make it a living, or needing a PhD in order to teach very fundamental classes. So there are a number of issues, and I want to acknowledge that. But the point is I just can't think of a more America first policy than making higher education more accessible and less cost prohibitive in order to advance our workforce. That's just the direction we're going. We're seeing AI, although it's narrow AI, so it's not general AI yet. But as we grow, it doesn't matter how much manufacturing we bring back. Capitalism is not into handouts, right? We're not going to just create manufacturing jobs that we're going to fill with as many bodies as we can. There's going to be this is business, right? We're going to do.
You want to know who they're going to hire for these positions? They're going to hire the people who are the most educated and who can create the most profit.
And then when it comes to skilled, or so that those who are working on the manufacturing line, it just, even with the whole framework of wages and being able to have that stuff just isn't that attractive. Yet it should be, because there's a huge portion of the population that we really need to do those jobs. I mean, this sounds like coldly economic when you think of like economists. We're talking about almost people as widgets, but from a 30,000 foot view, you do have to think about your workforces and your labor forces and who's doing what job. I mean, I just don't see us ever returning to a time where manufacturing was broadly accepted as like a great career path in the US. I just don't see that happening unless there's a huge change in China. But I don't think companies are dying unless there's some policy at the federal level that says you can't, which would be crazy. You will continue to see this human capital shift, and it will be overseas and will continue to be that way.
Yeah.
And I don't know what changes, Candace. Like, what changes? Is that a fundamental shift in how, like, policy and government, or?
This is an interesting point that you bring up at this time, because what is it? G7 just got surpassed by what, Saudi and Iran signing.
Where China mediated. They're going to bring embassies back over the next couple.
And now what it's Russia, China, India, Saudi, and Iran have like surpassed the U.S., Europe, and Canada in like GDP. I mean, but you also see, I think it's with parts of Apple's manufacturing process, just from like a tech standpoint, there's security of like technology, like copyright and patents. So, I mean, that's another reason that they're bringing manufacturing back, is because China wants to stipulate how the process goes, stipulate who has access to the technology. There's security concerns as who has access to the, Apple's patents.
Essentially
they're
get a cut.
Like, they're like, oh, you have to turn a blind eye to what we're doing here, or we're not going to let you check out your, assembly line process here. So I think there are going to be certain things that put a pressure on U.S. companies to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. or to Mexico, because I think it's actually Mexico. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Mexico right now is cheaper labor than China.
I'm
so
sure.
Far as shipping costs, labor, manufacturing, the whole process.
Yeah, I was going to say, from
cheaper.
The entire supply line from your resources through it landing on the shelves. And again, I want to shy away from appearing ethnocentric here. I think it isn't necessarily what I want, or it's just the reality of what is happening. And if it like you're pointing out, like if this stuff doesn't rectify, if our offshoring human capital for our cheaper product, like the reality is, if we can't make it cheaper, it's not going to be cheaper, right? It's going to be more expensive if we do bring it back. And so I want to acknowledge what would happen if we could bring manufacturing back, and we could create these jobs for individuals who don't want to go to college or go to a trade school, but it's going to cost more. We're already saying, like, minimum wage hasn't been increased since.
And it takes time.
And it does take time.
It costs more and it takes time.
So, but I still don't believe, and this is where we leave it for like the hour mark for my more political opinions to come out here. But when we talk about America first, like, this is the trajectory we're going. This is our self-actualized democracy, utilizing technology in a good way, will essentially make it, you'll just never have the factory lines the way you had with Ford and the Model T back in the day. That just is not going to exist. It's going to be robots and it's going to be AI. And people who are going to take care of that technology are going to need some sort of advanced education in order to use that. So it really doesn't matter. Education is not going away. And the need for it is not going away. But I do
want to touch on something before we finish to that exact point. It is the cost of education, right? Everyone's concerned with how much can you take off what people already owe, but that doesn't prevent people from accruing just as much debt in the future. And it's because of it is price gouging the cost of education. And if they can put a cap on how much nurses can earn after COVID, I mean, they said, well, you can't raise nurse like wages, then you can go ahead and put a wage or a cap on the cost of education.
Correct. Yeah. I mean,
I'm sorry, but the president of university does not need to be making millions of dollars a year. while they fire tenure professors and hire back on underpaid adjuncts.
Yeah. I mean,
while still charging people $20,000 to $40,000 a year.
I was going to say it is sort of, no. I mean, it's sort of that it is, look, again, this is not crapping on capitalism, but it is like, what can we do?
No, but it's preemptively reduce the debt that's going to accrue.
Correct.
Preemptive.
Yeah. There's many things that need to happen. And the overall question is, what does the SCOTUS, what do they do here? Honestly, I think the debt, I think it's not on the table. I think the Supreme Court axes that and sends it back to Congress. And I hope that the other pieces of this program move forward for the good of the American people, quite frankly. I just see education as I truly do, as a path forward for a lot of people and not everyone. And for those of us who are against having any conversation about relief from debt, I don't know where that comes from. I don't, like you said before, the nuts and bolts that we're ultimately all paying for this anyway. It's like the argument, oh, well, the taxpayers pay paid my salary as an Army officer. Well, you're correct, but I also paid for my own salary. So in essence, like, you could actually adjust my paycheck as someone in the Army and just reduce whatever whatever I paid into it. And that's actually what I'm actually paying, because I'm actually taking a cut every single paycheck from the taxes that I pay in, albeit not that much. But that's the point, right? Like, we all are paying into an existing healthcare. Everyone is paying into our healthcare system. Everyone is going to pay, and it's disingenuous, I think, really to say, like, this is going to be my burden. We're already paying for it. Taxes aren't going up. Taxes aren't going down. You're going to continue to pay the same in taxes. And this is going to, over the next, like, really long time, will be paid off like $4 billion, which, again, just for context, we spend $800 billion a year on defense alone. I agree with Republicans. I do. I say we need to, if not cut costs, we need to really dive in and figure out where we can be more efficient. We can be more productive. I totally agree with all of that. But in the grand scheme of all the money we have paid to corporations, to tax cuts, which have just not benefited the middle class, and the crazy amounts of money that we gave out during the pandemic to everyone that wasn't just an individual not owning a business, all that money that we've given, and we're concerned about $400 billion over, what was it? 3 decades. To me,
it's true. And I don't want to drag this out too much longer, but I think this might be the topic for another episode. This does not happen in a vacuum. And when you also look at the public education system and look at how many school districts are going to have to start shutting down or going to reduce days because they can't afford to pay teachers. So you have students leaving 12 years of public education just unprepared. Imagine if you reduce the cost, all the money that the federal government was paying in loans towards higher education was reduced. I mean, quite honestly, force universities to cap tuition. There is no reason to pay $70,000 a year for some degrees to a university, and reallocate that federal money towards public education. And if you can educate the public effectively over 12 years, you're also going to reduce the need for people to continue with higher education.
Yep, I absolutely agree. And I think what we need to tee up for the next part of this series, and maybe I'll go back and tee this up as like part 1 of student loans, is like, why do we have, because there's a fiscal, like, responsibility, conservatism here. Like, I get that. I do. I manage P&Ls. That is part of my job. I am graded on that, right? That is like fundamentally.
I get it. I
right?
get it. I do a similar thing.
So I like 100% agree, like with being smart. But here we are saying like, well, one side is being super unsmart, $400 billion over 30 years. I mean, this is pennies compared to what we've spent over the last, since 2008, right? It's pennies. And so what I want to dive into next is, what are the real reasons public education? So we think of, and we're going to have, this is why I think we need to have more conversations about it. We're looking at Ron DeSantis in Florida, who is fundamentally trying to change public school, school choice, where like all this stuff. Like, is the price of it, or giving some sort of relief in debt, relief to 20 million plus Americans, 43? Is it really about the money, or is it really about something else? And I do think, going back to Freeman's original quote, that an educated proletariat is going to be the downfall, so we can't do it. I do believe that there's some undercurrent that has continued to today. And I think like ideology plays a role into it. Both political, cultural, and religious ideology plays a role into public education, and just sort of the fear around. I mean, it's just been ongoing, right, since evolution became a thing. So yeah. I think we do have an opportunity to talk about this a bit more, and I'm kind of excited about it. So
me too. I would ask that everyone who listens to, past the hour, please watch the revisionaries before we pick up next episode, because I think that'll frame a lot of this pretty well.
I agree. Okay.
Passing out homework.
Passing out homework. Okay.
I'm gonna hop off.
So let's we have 16 questions for our quiz. I was going to do capitals, but now we're going to do slang through the ages vocabulary quiz on Britannica.com. So put on your slang. Here we go. Essential to the 1980s Valley Girl lexicon, grody is synonymous with the word or phrase tight-fitting, disgusting, high in calories, delicious.
Gross.
Disgusting. So Frank Zappa, in his hit song Valley Girl in 1983, and his 14-year-old daughter Moon Unit, the word grody became a hallmark of the 1980s mall scene. Taken from a French term for middle class, which of these mildly mocking terms for being concerned about wealth and respectability? Bougie. It's bougie.
It's okay. Bougie.
I was looking for proletariat. I was like, wait, that would have been funny.
Those prodies.
Okay. Which of these people would most likely be described as a Weisenheimer? A bully, a smart aleck, a baby, or a bank clerk? You Weisenheimer? Smart
I don't
aleck,
want to touch this one.
Smart aleck. Appeared early 20th century. Weisenheimer combined the word wise with Inheimer, a reference to a smart-sounding German family name. Okay. I guess. Yikes.
You wise guy.
All right. Criminals going for a stay in the Hoosgo are about to spend time where? A cheap motel, a hideout, jail, or near a house they're looking to rob?
Jail.
A Hoosgow.
Hoosgow, yep.
Is a corruption of the Spanish term juzgado, which means a panel of judges or a courtroom. Okay. Kids in the 1970s were labeled space cadets if they were overachieving, forgetful, nerdy, or bad smelling.
Forgetful
Space cadet. Okay, that's
me.
That one has stood the test of time so far. So before it was used, referring to someone whose mind was of in outer space. In 1948, sci-fi author Robert Heinlein wrote Space Cadet about a character who hoped to achieve the titular rank, Space Cadet. Okay. Which of these animal names is slang for pretending to be a different person online? Skunk, butterfly, chameleon, or catfish?
Catfish.
Boom. Got that modern culture. All right. Which of these flavorful words is synonymous with angry and bitter? Salty, savory, sugary, spicy. Ooh, is it salty or spicy?
It's salty.
Yeah. Okay, good. Although salty has enjoyed a linguistic resurgence, the usage was first recorded in African American newspapers in the 1930s. Thanks, Britannica. What sort of person would be described as the bee's knees? Extremely thin, overly judgmental, highly admired, or a compulsive liar?
Highly admired.
Highly admired.
She's just great. She's
Others include the cat's meow, the ant's pants, and the eel's ankles. Dude, I'm bringing back the ant's pants. I like the ant's pants better than the bee's knees. You're just the ant's pants.
Oh. Yeah, the eel's ankles. I don't understand where that one came from. That one's pretty interesting.
It doesn't roll off the tongue quite the same way. Okay.
Doesn't make any sense.
If you've been hornwoggled, you've been deceived by a fraud, getting high grades in school, smitten by a love interest, or made muscular with weightlifting. I think you've been deceived by a fraud.
I think you have been deceived.
Yep. Experts are absolutely flummoxed as how hornswoggle entered into the English language, only noting that it originated in the southern United States during the 19th century. Okay, almost done. If you were giving someone the side eye, what are you doing? Flirting, looking at them scornfully, checking out their valuables, or sneaking a peek at them? I think it's looking at them.
Looking at them scornfully.
Yeah, okay. That's right. Cool. During which activity would someone most likely yell YOLO? Playing a board game, being audited, ordering fast food, or skydiving?
Being audited, no skydiving.
YOLO. All right.
Probably being audited as well.
Skydiving is correct. A couple more questions. A person in the 1830s going to see the Sawbones was going where? Ooh, to a surgeon, to a trainer, to a theatrical performance, or to the butcher? Oh.
To a surgeon.
You think?
Also a butcher.
Which one?
Is surgeon.
Oh, that is correct. Oof. I mean, Sawbones. How about just to the corner?
They would. That's probably what happened after you saw Sawbones.
Ugh.
A little bit of gangrene.
Exactly. All right. Since the 1840s, which of these has been known as ankle biters? Mob enforcers, snakes, young children, or poison ivy leagues?
Young children.
You are correct. In addition to describing rugrats, ankle biters, it also sometimes meant to mean aggressive small dog. A term originating from the game Among Us, sus is short for what? Suspender, suspicious, sustain, or sushi? Among Us.
Suspicious.
Correct. Good job. And almost done. Usually more graceful than something with hooves. A hoofer is what type of professional? A dancer, a reporter, a butcher, or a doctor?
A dancer.
Dude, we might have gone 100%. Okay, last one. Inspired by how the actor Humphrey Bogart smoked cigarettes, to bogart something means what? To pretend to enjoy, to use only a little, to not share, or to consume quickly?
Consume quickly.
To not share. Wow.
Oh.
Star of classic films such as Casablanca, Humphrey Bogart often would keep a cigarette dangling between his lips until the cigarette was almost gone. Bogarting became slang for consuming something without sharing, thanks to this usage in the 1969 film Easy Rider. All right.
Shame on me.
How could you not? Come on. All right. Well, much appreciated. I thought this was a good show. I do think we continue to talk about this. Obviously, the case will come out, or they'll make a ruling on it, and I think there'll be some broader conversation. Obviously, student loans are turning back on. I think that's something we should talk about soon in terms of what that looks like and our predictions broadly across the U.S. and what that's going to do. I can tell you, I guarantee most people haven't been thinking about student loans turning back on. If we don't have any sort of finance class ever in public education, the idea that 43 million people have been budgeting for their student loans to turn back on in August seems unlikely. So I think we've got some subsequent awesome episodes. So as always, thank you for being here again with me. We'll put the show notes in. As always, if you have any comments, hit us up at modstate@modstate.com or leave your comments wherever you can, where you're listening to your podcast. We thank Podomatic.com. And of course, you, Candace, thank you for being with me on this Sunday. So
thank you, Nate.
Until next time, we'll see ya.